Okay, hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I want to continue my reading of the forewords, the preface and forewords of Diaries, and this one is the Diaries of Sir Ernest Mason SATOW, 1883 to 1888, when he was mainly in Siam, although it says a diplomat in Siam, Japan, Britain, and elsewhere. The photograph, I believe, actually, is from Morocco, this photograph. I had thought it was from Siam, but I think I was mistaken about that. So in some versions, I have changed the photograph to one I know is from Siam, which is this boat, which SATOW sketched on a trip to Chiang Mai from Bangkok. Okay, so that one I have no doubt at all that it's Siam. Anyway, let me read the preface which I wrote, and then the foreword by Sir David Warren. So, preface. The project of making the important and valuable diaries and letters of Sir Ernest SATOW, PC GCMG, deposited by the terms of his will after his death in the Public Record Office, now the National Archives of the UK, more easily available in book and digital form to scholars, students, and the general reading public, began with the Diaries and Letters of Sir Ernest Mason SATOW, 1843 to 1929, a scholar, diplomat in East Asia, Edwin Mellon Press, 1998. It has since become a time-consuming but most absorbing, enjoyable, and rewarding life work. I first encountered SATOW in 1993 when living in Kobe and writing a modest local history paper about the Kobe incident, the Kobe Jiken of 1868. Already in Japan since the 1st of April 1988, I was starting out on my career as a Japan-based scholar and needed to produce evidence, however meager, of scholarly endeavor in a specialist field, senmon, as they say in Japanese, for the purpose of gaining full-time employment in a Japanese university. SATOW had written at length about the neglected but significant diplomatic incident which had occurred at Kobe in his widely acclaimed A Diplomat in Japan, see chapter 26, The Bizen Affair. He had explained how he and A.B. Mitford, later Lord Redesdale, had been ordered by Sir Harry Parkes to witness the judicial suicide, harakiri, or sometimes seppuku, which was ordered as a punishment for the unfortunate officer of the Bizen clan named Taki Zenzaburo. What intrigued me most was SATOW's statement: "It was no disgusting exhibition, but a most decent and decorous ceremony, and far more respectable than what our own countrymen were in the habit of producing for the entertainment of the public in front of Newgate Prison." This is from A Diplomat in Japan, first edition, 1921, pages 346 to 7. I simply had to know more about Ernest SATOW from that moment, and his eye-catching and seemingly very modern willingness to make thought-provoking cross-cultural comparisons. The attempt to get to know him better has led me through all the 9 decades of his life and across the world to all of the places where he served and lived: Japan, Siam, Thailand, Uruguay, Morocco, China, and Britain. Following his life and career closely through his diaries and letters has been a wonderful and privileged journey, which is still ongoing, and I have learned a great deal from it so far. It is my earnest hope that the present volume will interest and be of value to scholars of Siam, Thailand, as well as those of Japan and of SATOW himself. He has left to posterity a rare and precious legacy, as yet not fully or appropriately exploited. My sincere thanks are due to Sir David Warren, a former British ambassador to Japan from 2008 to 2012, and presently chairman of the Japan Society of the UK, for writing the foreword to the present book. I'm also grateful to Lulu.com for the opportunity to publish these diaries and previous works of mine in affordable paperback and digital formats. Finally, I would like to dedicate this book to the memory of Dr. Nigel Brayley of Bristol University, who was well aware of the importance of the SATOW Siam diaries for scholars of that country, and who I believe would be pleased that this book has at last appeared. Ian Ruxton, Kyushu Institute of Technology, October 2016. And now I will read the foreword by Sir David Warren to the Diaries of Sir Ernest Mason SATOW, 1883 to 1888. Foreword. Sir Ernest SATOW, 1843 to 1929, one of the most distinguished diplomatists of his era, is chiefly celebrated as a pioneer Japanologist. He arrived in Yokohama in 1862 as a student interpreter for the Foreign Office, spent the rest of the decade in Japan as a witness of the civil war that led to the restoration of the Emperor Meiji, and after a period on leave in Europe, returned to what was now the British mission in Tokyo as the Japanese secretary. From his earliest years in East Asia to almost the end of his life, he kept a diary, and this record of his activities, together with many personal letters to his friends and colleagues, is now kept in the National Archive. SATOW's early years in Japan were full of turbulence and adventure. He was involved in the intense diplomatic activity through which Britain sought to build links with the clans competing for power as the influence of the Tokugawa government waned and that of the Emperor's party grew. He was a diplomat, not a soldier, but he also participated in military action. In the bombardment of Kagoshima in 1863 and the Battle of Shimonoseki the following year. And the world in which he lived in Japan was one of intermittent violence rather than sedate diplomacy. More than once, he faced physical danger from traveling samurai hostile to foreigners. By the 1870s, perhaps frustrated by the routine of more conventional diplomatic work, perhaps in reaction to working for a minister, the mission had not yet become a full embassy. Sir Harry Parkes, for whom he felt little sympathy, SATOW was becoming somewhat detached from his diplomatic responsibilities. He had already established himself as the best Japanese linguist among his peers. Moreover, he had an omnivorous and polymathic appetite for understanding Japan, the language, the culture, the society. He began a career as a scholar of Japan, helping to found the Asiatic Society and contributing numerous essays and papers on all things Japanese, art, religion, geography, and geology over the next 10 years. He translated books of history and published a Japanese conversation textbook on which he had been working since the mid-1860s. He also formed a union with Takeda Kane, variously described as the daughter of the embassy gardener or of a cabinet maker in Tokyo. It is unclear exactly when they met. Takeda was born in November 1853 and would have been 14 when the Meiji Restoration took place in 1867-1868. A daughter was born to them in 1872 and died in early infancy. Two sons, Eitaro and Hisakichi, were born in 1880 and 1883. It would have been virtually impossible under Japanese law for him to have married Takeda and unthinkable to have acknowledged the relationship publicly within the Foreign Office or the diplomatic community. There is no reference to SATOW's family in his diaries or letters during this period in his life. Okay, just one point there. Hisakichi later became known as Hisayoshi. The present volume deals with the years 1883 to 1888, for most of which SATOW was posted to Bangkok in what is now Thailand and was then Siam. At the beginning of 1883, SATOW left Japan to return to Britain on home leave. He spent the whole of 1883 away from Asia, working in the Foreign Office in London on the proposed revision of the Treaty of Amity and Friendship with Japan, traveling around Britain to see friends, around Europe, Italy, France, Switzerland, visiting art galleries, enjoying concerts, and spending time with his extended family. He was one of 11 children, and although his father had died 10 years previously, his mother was still in the family house in Clapton. In addition to all this, SATOW resumed his law studies in the Inns of Court and passed his examination with distinction in November. SATOW's diaries are rarely revealing about his innermost thoughts. The modern reader has to scour the record to find clues to the tension which may have existed in his mind between his intellectual and personal commitment to Japan and his role and possible advancement as a Foreign Office diplomat. But reading between these lines, one can see that he was at a crucial moment in his career and that he understood this. He had served for 20 years in Japan as a member of the Japan Consular Service rather than the Diplomatic Service. He wanted to make the transition to the latter. He may well also have wanted to move away from concentrating solely on Japanese affairs. We can only guess to what extent, if at all, his personal circumstances may have been relevant to any of these considerations. To a modern reader, it seems inexplicable that he should leave Japan just as his wife, in inverted commas, his common-law wife, was about to give birth to their second son. Towards the end of 1883, he discussed his prospects with Sir Francis Plunkett, who was about to replace Sir Harry Parkes as minister in Tokyo. Plunkett wanted SATOW to return to Japan to help him with the forthcoming negotiations on treaty revision, but generously did not want to stand in SATOW's way if this might impede his career. Almost immediately, SATOW became aware that the Foreign Office was considering him for the post of Agent and Consul General in Bangkok, in what was then Japan. He was encouraged to think it over. This does not seem to have been a lengthy process. He applied for the job and was told in early January 1884 that his name had been submitted to the Queen for her approval. He left for his post on the 25th of January. It was to be a difficult 3 years for SATOW in Bangkok. Siam was an independent kingdom, pursuing Western-style reforms under King Chulalongkorn, son of King Mongkut. Under his father's influence, Chulalongkorn had received a broad education, including exposure to European tutors. Among them was Anna Leonowens, whose service at the Siamese court was subsequently romanticized through her own memoirs and various semi-fictional versions, most famously the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, The King and I. The king's policy was to play off both the British and the French, who were seeking to advance their own imperial ambitions in Southeast Asia. SATOW's main responsibility was to work for closer Siamese relations with Britain against a background of rivalry with France, who were at war with China in neighboring Indochina, now Vietnam, and successful British attempts to annex Burma. This objective was complicated by the Colonial Office and the government of Singapore pressing the territorial claims against Siam of the Federation of Malay States. SATOW's new post brought effective and in due course substantive promotion. He was upgraded to the rank of minister the following year. But almost immediately he regretted applying for it. In a diary entry for the 26th of February 1884, he described saying farewell to the Plunketts in Singapore as they set off for Japan. I wished I were going back to Japan with them instead of being an exile in Bangkok. He had less time for study and scholarship and found Siam a difficult and unhealthy climate. He missed Japan and the work on the revision of the unequal treaties that he would have been doing in Tokyo had he returned there. In a letter to his friend, Frederick Victor Dickens, in March 1884, he wrote, "I never think of that country without the liveliest feelings of regret. One was so happy there in spite of the distance from England, and the traveling in the interior was delightful. Sometimes I think I was a great fool to leave it simply for promotion." Little of this emerges in the diaries, which are taken up with the minutiae of SATOW's professional responsibilities and his usual botanical and travel observations. He found Siamese officials frustrating to work with, and some of the irritation he felt at their conservatism and evasiveness can be sensed in these diary entries. But he consciously eschewed the choleric approach of Harry Parkes and was at pains to keep his temper. When one is angry, he wrote, it is very important to be more polite than usual and to have an air of regret at having to remonstrate. There is much in his journal about the details of court etiquette, with SATOW hypersensitive to slights, both imagined and real. He sounds frustrated and bored, which he never appears to have been in Tokyo. In the autumn of 1884, SATOW returned to Japan, spending October and most of November there, and calling on not only his diplomatic colleagues, but many British and Japanese friends with whom he had maintained close contacts. By the way, I have done a video about that, which includes a PowerPoint presentation. He also saw his Japanese family again, although the first reference to them in his diary is written in Romanized Japanese so as to remain secret. This was the first time he had seen his younger son, Hisakichi. He wrote, He is of fair complexion and looks much like my younger brother Theodore. He gave a paper on notes on the intercourse between Japan and Siam in the 17th century to the Asiatic Society, and attended a garden party at the palace, commenting dyspeptically, "The Mikado looked more idiotic than ever and could only mumble some inarticulate words which meant nothing. He is horribly ugly." He was to visit again in 1886, spending 3 months there to convalesce after illness. Again, I cover this in the separate video. His friends expressed the hope that he would be able to return to Tokyo as Plunkett's successor, and it is clear that Sato aspired to this too. Indeed, there appears to have been a possibility of this in 1885, although it never materialized, as Plunkett was unwilling to be moved to Peking in succession to Parkes, who had died in that year. In professional terms, there were certain parallels between Japan and Siam. Both were countries under monarchical rulers coming to terms with late 19th century modernization, energetically in the case of Japan, cautiously in the case of Siam. Both had resisted becoming colonies of Western powers, but nonetheless had to deal with those powers, seeking to enfold independent states within their spheres of influence and imperial control. The question of extraterritoriality was important. Britain had negotiated special legal rights over its expatriates in Japan in the unequal treaty with Japan. This had a parallel in Siam, where Sato's time was taken up increasingly with disputes over the registration of British subjects and the juridical power of British courts in areas of dispute with the Siamese authorities. One of the interesting developments in Sato's thinking at this time is his gradually increasing sympathy with the idea of repatriating local legal rights over expatriate communities. At times, this amounts to antipathy to predatory British imperialism. He wrote to Dickens in April 1886, "The English people no longer content themselves with territories they can make use of themselves. They have begun to collectionner tropical countries for the benefit of Asiatics, chiefly Chinese and Klings, who flock together wherever the easygoing colonial official sets up business. For the colonial man is quite a different sort from the Indian official, much less of a benevolent despot, not as to benevolence, but as to despotism." This is from Sato's letters to Aston and Dickens, a volume which I have published, or at least it appears there. Of course, it's from the original papers. At the same time, he maintained little faith in the Siamese legal system, and as Professor Ruxton, quoting the late Nigel Brayley, notes in his reference to Sato's travel diary, this and his contraction of malaria did nothing to improve his disposition towards the Siamese people or their customs. The tension between these conflicting feelings doubtless contributed to his general unhappiness. By the end of his time in Bangkok, this amounted almost to a crisis of confidence in his chosen career, to the point of his briefly considering early retirement from the diplomatic service. In addition, his health was weakening in Siam. His doctor friend, William Willis, to whom he had been close in Japan, came to Bangkok to keep him company. Sato suffered attacks of malaria and lost a lot of weight. He traveled from Bangkok to Chiang Mai. The account of the trip was posthumously published under the title A Diplomat in Siam, but the rigors of that journey aggravated his condition further. It is not clear whether the separation from Sato's Japanese family played any part in his overall malaise during these years. Sato never recorded such personal details, even in his letters to Dickens, to whom he wrote relatively frank accounts of his professional unhappiness. We can only guess at the emotions that lay behind the brief and often clinical references in the diaries and letters. On top of all this, his relations with some of the local British expatriates in Bangkok were poor. He had already formed something of an animus against British businessmen in Japan. In Siam, he fell out with some senior British residents who complained about rules requiring them to register and pay a registration fee to the British legation. Sato's account of a meeting with the two ringleaders of the campaign against him in December 1886 reveals him in uncharacteristically pompous and high-handed mode, bridling at what he took to be devious and impertinent behavior on their part. Predictably, they made their dissatisfaction public. A report in the Times of London of the 11th of February 1887 spoke of quite a commotion among the British residents in Bangkok and a determination to resist this impost. The men in question were close to Prince Thewawong, one of the king's half-brothers, also known as Devawongsi or Devan, who was the king's correspondence secretary when SATOW arrived in Siam. The controversy soured SATOW's relationship with Thewawong, whom he suspected of conspiring against him. It all contributed to making his life in Siam miserable. SATOW left Siam in May 1887, accompanying Thewawong to Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. In July, he attended a meeting at the Foreign Office on territorial questions, the future of Perak, the British protected Malay state to the south of the Siamese Peninsula. This went badly, with the Siamese prince resigning from what the British had taken to be a commitment to agree to their terms on the disputed border territory of Raman. He implied that he was reacting against the way in which SATOW had attempted to present him with a fait accompli. SATOW, already debilitated, was angered by what he believed to be Thewawong's duplicity, and his response antagonized the Siamese prince. Lord Salisbury read the Riot Act to Thewawong subsequently, but declined to record the meeting in what was seen as a snub to SATOW for mishandling the issue. SATOW had already written to the Foreign Office requesting a transfer from Bangkok on health grounds, to no avail. Following the row over Raman, the idea appears to have gained currency within the Foreign Office that it would be better for him not to return to Siam. He learned that Tokyo was not now a possibility. He considered applying for Bern, Switzerland, but was not encouraged. He was told that he should be thinking of a South American posting. He was unenthusiastic about moving to one of the unstable post-Iberian Empire states. But in late 1888, after inconclusive discussions about going to Venezuela and Chile, he was eventually announced as minister resident in Montevideo in Uruguay. These diaries end with that appointment. The last entry for 1888 has SATOW copying a Japanese translation of Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ he had discovered in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. SATOW had spent much of the second half of 1887 and 1888 on leave from the Foreign Office. During this period, he was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn at the conclusion of his legal studies and spent some months traveling in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, studying the early Christian missionaries in 17th century Japan, as a result of which he wrote a monograph on the Jesuit mission press in Japan, 1591 to 1610, which was much admired. His cousin and early biographer Bernard Allen believed that it was while reading Thomas à Kempis in Oxford that he experienced a spiritual conversion. He had been brought up a nonconformist but had drifted away from religious observances. He was confirmed in the Church of England in a ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral by the Bishop of London in October 1888. From that point, wrote Allen, after SATOW's death, religion was the center of his life, was at the center of his life. There are references in his personal writings as late as 1899 to a continued interest in converting to Roman Catholicism. It is hard to escape the conclusion that the strains of his years in Siam may have nudged him in this direction. He had been separated from the country and culture by which he was fascinated and from which he drew energy. He was bogged down in arduous and thankless diplomatic negotiations in an intractable environment. He was physically enervated, and perhaps he was also now doubting the diplomatic career in pursuit of which he had given up Japan, as well as contact with his Japanese family. Whatever the cause, the years in Siam were the closest SATOW appears to have come to a dark night of the soul, following which he adopted a serious and increasingly devotional attitude to religion. SATOW's diaries are not, on the whole, full of colourful incidents and anecdotes, pen pictures, evocative descriptions, or meditations on the meaning of his life and the world through which he passed. They are functional diaries recording what he did and what he said, where he went and whom he met, and from time to time what he saw. Occasional personal revelations, in this volume about a family dispute where SATOW had to mediate between warring family factions, and a younger brother whose marital and financial difficulties were a source of concern to him, also emerge from time to time. As the years pass and SATOW moves from being a callow young interpreter to a seasoned and respected senior official, the diaries become more functional rather than less. But they are an important and unique record of a diplomat's life in the second half of the 19th century and of the development of British policy in its informal empire in Asia. Informal empire in inverted commas. They also add greatly to our knowledge of a man whose long life encompassed the heyday of Britain's imperial reach and foreign policy ambitions, whose insight, especially into East Asia, where Britain was a power but not a colonial force, is unique, and whose personal records in terms of journals and correspondence are unusually full. In SATOW's Siamese years, we see him conscientiously discharging his official duties in a difficult and unsympathetic environment. Japan, the country that gave him focus and purpose in intellectual and personal terms, was both a recent memory and an uncertain aspiration. Eventually, he was to return as British minister from 1895 to 1900. His diaries for that period have already been published as part of Professor Ruxton's project of bringing this important primary source material to a wider audience. We owe Professor Ruxton much gratitude for his outstanding work in making the diaries of this important but neglected figure more generally available. David Warren, August 2016. And I thank him very, very much for that wonderful foreword. I will see you again soon. Goodbye.